Good evening, live from the River Tweed. On the great stone towers that stand at either end of this bridge, there's a Latin motto that reads Vis Unita Fortior, which means roughly, united we're stronger. It was put there in 1820. But 1 year from now, will the Scottish people hold to that view and the Union, or will they vote to make Scotland an independent sovereign state again? And what would this border look like then? We brought leading lights from the rival campaigns to this bridge to try to win the hearts and minds of our audience. Earlier this evening, they made their case, and later our undecided voters will be returning here to the bridge to cast their votes live. Here's how the night unfolded. A year from now, the people of Scotland will vote. The question on the ballot will be, should Scotland be an independent country, yes or no? And all the polls suggest it's the undecided gathered here tonight who will determine the future of this country.
I hope to hear a lot about the economic side. I'd like to hear about the Queen. Lots of things. I'm sure things will come up that I never thought I needed to know about.
It would be very nice to be, I suppose, a bit more informed. A connection to Europe, the trade, the involvement with Europe, and with how we'd be affected by not being, part of Britain, essentially divided away from Britain, the rest of Britain. I think, especially being on the border, it's quite a big issue for us where we live.
The latest polling puts Better Together ahead by between 10 and 20%, with about 1 in 5 voters still undecided. So the result of next year's referendum is still far from certain. It's these men and women the campaigns must now convince. Tonight we'll be thrashing out some of the big questions about the economics of independence, the future of Trident, whether an independent Scotland would be in NATO, who gets the oil revenues if Scotland votes yes to independence, and how would Scotland's close relationship to England change if Scotland was a sovereign state. On the panel, voting yes to independence, the Deputy First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and Pat Kane, cultural commentator and musician. Voting no a year from now, Margaret Curran, the shadow Scottish Secretary of State for Scotland, and the businesswoman, Tessa Hartman. Now, we are going to kick off with short pitches from our main protagonists, Nicola Sturgeon and Margaret Curran, on the toss of a coin, so here goes. Which would you like? Would you like heads or would you like tails?
Heads.
Heads. Heads it is. Nicola Sturgeon, make your pitch for independence.
Scotland can more than afford to be independent. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We more than pay our way. In each and every one of the past 30 years, when oil prices have been high and when oil prices have been low, Scotland has generated more tax per head of population than the UK as a whole. So there is no question that Scotland can be a successful independent country. The question is, should we be? And my argument is that it's better for all of us if decisions about Scotland are taken in Scotland by the people who care most, those of us who live and work here. We've demonstrated that with the devolution of power over health and education. Independence is about completing the powers of our Parliament to bring home powers over the economy and welfare as well. Scotland's future in Scotland's hands has got to be better than leaving decisions in the hands of Westminster governments that very often we in Scotland don't even vote for.
Margaret Curran.
The debate we're having in Scotland, the debate we have tonight, is not a question of whether Scotland could be independent, it's a question of whether Scotland should be independent. You know, Scotland's got its own parliament now. We make real decisions here in Scotland about real issues that matter: health, education and housing. But I also think we benefit being part of that broader partnership that is the United Kingdom, where we pool resources and we share risk. As we saw during the recent financial crisis, I really think that helped Scotland and that was really important for us. But the question we have to ask ourselves, if we go for separation in the referendum that's coming next year, will it actually benefit us? Will it help our children? Will it help our grandchildren? Because it's a decision that is permanent. You know, I love Scotland. I want to do the very best for my country. But I have to ask, is the risk of uncertainty, of separation, is it really worth it, where we can really benefit from the partnership of the United Kingdom, have a strong Scotland and a strong Britain working in partnership together, rather than the division and the separation I think that the SNP propose?
OK, that's the opening pitches. Now we're going to begin with a discussion on the economics of independence. First, a thumbnail sketch. A new poll suggests Scotland would go for independence if it made people richer. 47% would vote to leave the Union if it made them just £500 a year better off. The SNP claim they'd better that. There would be £800 more in people's pockets because the Treasury takes more from Scotland in tax than they get back. But how well would Scotland fare going it alone? Let's start with revenue and the black stuff. The SNP reckons there are 24 billion barrels of oil left in the North Sea, and 90% of it is in Scotland's waters. Down in Westminster, the forecasting is more cautious. The value of what's left depends on a volatile market, but the latest estimate puts the tax take from oil sales at £56 billion over 20-odd years. What would independence mean for businesses operating on both sides of the border? And could the Scottish Government continue to spend in the same way? Scotland is spending about £20 billion more than it's raising each year. Public spending's reckoned to be about 10% higher north of the border. And then there's the gigantic issue of debt. What share of the UK's more than £1 trillion worth of public debt would Edinburgh have to take on? Oh, and don't forget the little issue of the RBS bailout. Should that all be dumped on Scotland? Or is it a Westminster problem? A poll today says that Scots would be £500 better off, and that would make a difference to them. That would be one of the big things that would make their minds up. And the SNP says it's £800 a head better off. Margaret Curran, would Scots be better off in an independent Scotland?
Well, I would challenge the very premise in which Nicola put her argument, which is to say that Scotland pays more into the United Kingdom than we get in return, and we challenge directly her figures. Because the Institute for Fiscal Studies themselves and many other commentators have said that actually more is spent in Scotland than we actually give back. Now, I think that's right. I think we deserve that because it should be based on need and not nationality. But I do think the Union works for Scotland, and I think that's the best way to go forward.
But would we be better off or worse off?
In independence? Well, on the basis of that, then I think we would be worse off. I also think economically, I don't think that that would help us because England is our biggest exporter. Why would we turn our biggest exporter into a competitor, not a partner, when it can work to our dual advantage if we stick together?
So the idea is that, according to the Scottish Government, we get more per capita of what? Is it 10% or 14%? How are you going to pay for these things? How are you going to pay in an independent Scotland for free prescriptions, free personal care? There will be no tuition fees. The benefit cut to the spare rooms will not be implemented in an independent Scotland. Where's that going to be paid for?
With the exception of the last example you used there, all of these things are delivered in Scotland right now, and we pay for all these things in a balanced budget. I believe Scotland will be better off as an independent country because I believe it's better if we take decisions about our own future ourselves. But I also believe we'll be economically better off. Margaret said we've got higher spending in Scotland. Let me just give you two statistics. In the last year, we've got figures available for 2011-12. Spending on benefits was about £60 a head higher in Scotland than in the UK as a whole. But in that same year, we contributed £1,700 more in tax per head than the UK as a whole. So let's have no nonsense about Scotland not being able to afford to be independent. We can absolutely afford it. The question is, where is it best to have decisions taken? Here in Scotland or with Tory governments in Westminster that very often we don't vote for, and that's the heart of this argument.
What do people in the audience think? Would it make a difference if you thought you were going to be £500 better off or £500 worse off, or what? Would that make a difference to you? Gentleman there, yes, with the check shirt on. Tell me about that for you.
I mean, I think if we were going to be £500 better off in an independent Scotland, that would obviously give credence to the argument about Scotland being better off as a whole. But I suppose I'm slightly sceptical because we just don't know at this point. We're being told, obviously, that we will be better off by the Yes campaign, and we're hearing the opposite story from the No campaign.
See, the problem is, Jim Gallagher, just coming to you here, the problem is that we just don't know in Scotland. People in Scotland just don't know the true figures, do they?
Well, I don't think it... first of all, I don't think I would buy and sell my country for £500. I hope nobody else here would. But let's understand, first of all, what kind of figures we're talking about. What Nicola's been talking about is public spending and taxation. And it's quite easy to understand what that actually is.
And, of course, you being a former senior civil servant, you understand,
too.
too.
I spent a lot of time adding up these sums. Okay? Straightforwardly, Scotland onshore, leaving aside oil for the moment, raises about 1% less every year per head in tax than the UK. Scotland spends onshore about 11% more than the UK. If that was all there was to it, Scotland would be in big trouble. But, of course, an independent Scotland would have the oil. The oil almost makes up the difference. And the problem for an independent Scotland, however, was if it spent all the oil, it couldn't save it as well. And if you're going to have oil, one of the things you should do with it is save it. But you can't both save it and spend it.
To your left, Ivan McKee, who's a businessman who supports independence. You're shaking your head violently at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jim's been a bit disingenuous with the numbers there. I mean, I'm not blessed with a civil service career. I spend my time buying and selling companies, so I spend a lot of time adding up numbers as well. I started off being a bit sceptical about the numbers last year, and I had a good look at them, as if I would do as if I was buying a company. And I've been right through all the numbers, and they're all available on the internet for anybody who wants to look at them. But basically what they say is exactly what Nicola said. Scotland raises £1,700 more per head than the UK average, spends £1,200 more per head than the UK average. So the finances are extremely strong in that context. There's absolutely no debate about that. It's a fact.
Well, let's look at this question of oil. Glenn Campbell and Alex Massey. Alex Massey for the Union, Glenn Campbell for the BBC. Where do we stand on oil? Because, of course, the oil price is volatile. For the Nationalists to say that a lot of their spending is predicated on the oil price is very tricky, because we don't actually know in the United Kingdom whose revenues are whose, do we, from the oil?
Well, oil is obviously a huge resource, and much of it would accrue to Scotland. It is assumed in the event of independence. As you say, the value of oil goes up and down. What the SNP would hope to do is to tuck away some of that money and save it, as Norway has, to invest in future and for times when things are tougher. The question that was raised a moment or two ago by Jim Gallagher is, at what point would they be able to do that if on day one much of the money was already allocated to other things?
Alex Massey.
Well, one of the things is that we don't hear very much about an oil fund from John Swinney anymore, because John Swinney is a realist, and on current projections there isn't going to be the money for an oil fund and the spending commitments that the SNP have currently made, or for the future of an independent Scotland. But one of the things that we also see is that, according to recent polls, something like 59% of Scots expect taxes to go up after independence. And it's not difficult, but only 29% think public services would improve. And it's not difficult to imagine that this puts something of a brake upon people's enthusiasm for independence.